The defeat of Paulus's army in the Battle of Stalingrad and the subsequent counteroffensive of the Red Army in the winter of 1943 led to the liberation of huge territories of the country and the transition of strategic initiative to the Soviet troops. However, in March, the offensive of the Red Army in Ukraine was stopped. The Germans transferred the reserves from France to this direction and made an unexpected counterattack. As a result, Kharkov, Belgorod, and the territories adjacent to them were left again. At the end of March, spring began to unravel, and the Wehrmacht units received an order to go to defense. As a result, the offensive of the Red Army in the winter of 1943 in eastern Ukraine and the subsequent counteroffensive of the Wehrmacht in the center of the Soviet-German front formed a ledge with a depth of up to 150 and a width of 200 kilometers, which later received the name of the Kursk barrier. It is worth noting that at that time not a single side possessed a full-fledged strategic initiative, so any mistake in further planning could lead to tragic consequences. In turn, the German command decided to carry out a strategic offensive operation, during which it would surround and destroy the Soviet troops on the Kursk barrier with 2 strikes in the adjacent directions of the north and south, seize strategic initiative, and turn the course of the war in its favor. To do this, a military operation, codenamed the Citadel, was developed and approved in April of 1943. The northern face of the barrier was to be attacked by the strike force of the Army Group Center, commanded by Walter Model, and the troops of the Army Group South, under the command of Erich von Manstein, acted on the southern face. The Soviet military intelligence managed to temporarily reveal the preparation of the German army for a major offensive on the Kursk barrier. In many ways, thanks to the agents of the Cambridge 5 and the Dora Group, the most important intelligence data on the general plan of the Citadel operation was obtained. Having analyzed the situation, the headquarters decided to move to defense on the Kursk barrier and in the course of a defensive battle to neutralize the enemy's strike groups in order to later create favorable conditions for the transition of the Soviet troops into a counteroffensive. Initially, the start date of the operation was appointed by Hitler on May 3rd. However, most of the German general staff, relying on the intelligence data, was alarmed by the power of the Soviet defense fortifications and stood for the fact that it was necessary to accumulate enough forces and form as many tank units as possible, as a result of which the onset dates were moved to July. The special hopes of the German command were laid on the use of new samples of combat vehicles, such as the Tiger and Panther tanks and the Ferdinand assault guns. For the operation, the Citadel attracted the most combat-capable units in a total of 50 divisions. The group of German troops consisted of 780,000 people, about 10,000 mortar guns, 2,700 tanks, and assault guns, 2,050 aircraft. They were opposed by the Central Front of Rokossovsky and the Voronezh Front of Batudin. By the beginning of July, under the command of General Rokossovsky, there were 712,000 people, 1,800 tanks and self-propelled artillery, 12,000 mortar guns. In turn, the Voronezh Front had 626,000 people, 1,700 tanks, and almost 9,000 mortar guns. In addition, several armies of the Steppe Military District, which were in the reserve of Stavka, were lined up at the base of the outpost. The front line was literally turned into a huge fortress. The Soviet units had powerful and well-equipped defenses in 3 bands, rich in anti-tank means. In particular, only in the band of the Voronezh Front, 4,200 kilometers of trenches were cut off, 500 kilometers of anti-tank barriers were built. The overall coordination of the actions of the fronts was laid out by representatives of the Stavka, marshals of the Soviet Union Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky. It is worth noting that the main problem of our defense on the Kursk arc was the lack of heavy artillery. The Soviet light guns were useless against the new German tanks, and the new heavy guns had just entered production and clearly did not have time to start the battle. Then it was decided to apply a new defense tactic. If earlier anti-tank guns were lined up in one line along the front, now they were united into anti-tank support points. If the enemy tanks tried to break through between the support points, the guns opened fire on their more vulnerable side armor. At the same time, A long delay with the Germans' transition to the offensive made Stalin himself nervous. However, soon captured in captivity, the German engineer unleashed his last doubts. At the interrogation, he very frankly said that the German troops were advancing on the European time at 2 a.m. on July 5th. At the same time, the headquarters of the Central and Voronezh Fronts decided to conduct an counter-artillery training on July 5th at night, as a result of which the SS Wehrmacht units, which were in the vanguard, suffered losses and began the offensive a little later than planned. At 6 o'clock in the morning, unprecedented German artillery training began. A giant avalanche of fire fell on Soviet positions. In light of the fire shaft, the entire military power of the Reich, which had been tightening its course for several months, came into motion. The tank columns of the Hitlerites moved with a steel wedge to our trenches. At the beginning of Operation Citadel, the scout of the 222nd Guards Rifle Regiment Lev Malkin recalled, the artillery training of the enemy continued in the defense line of the regiment for more than an hour. A fierce battle broke out throughout the defense line. Under the cover of a smoke screen, the Hitlerites went on an assault. In the offensive on the northern face of the Kursk, the Germans used the high technologies of that time to break through the passages in the minefields, using the Boer-Ward radio-controlled tank. However, the large number of crows from the shells on the battlefield prevented the Ferdinands from recognizing the passages made by the tanks, which were not marked in any way, as a result of which the Ferdinands began to break off from the path and blow up one after another. In addition, the Soviet anti-tankmen broke the running part of the Ferdinands, thereby immobilizing the giant armored vehicles. It should be noted that by the evening of the first day of the offensive, half of them had failed. On the northern face of the Kursk, the main strike of the German troops was made in the direction of Alkovatka, in the lane of the 13th Army of Pukov. Fierce battles were deployed around the perimeter of the front. At the very first hours of the battle, the commander of the Central Front, Rokossovsky, led the 2nd Tank Army of General Lieutenant Rodin into battle. However, the counterattack was unsuccessful. At the end of the first day of the offensive, the Germans managed to break through the first line of defense of the Soviet troops, move 8 kilometers, and reach the second line of defense in the area of the northern Alkovatka. But in the future, without achieving success, on July 9th, Model struck in the direction of the railway station Panay. By force of heavy armored vehicles of the Wehrmacht, it was possible to break deep into the rear of the Panay Soviet units. However, here the Germans got into a fire bag of several fighter tank artillery regiments, and, in the end, they could not break through the Soviet defense. After several days of fierce battles, neither under Alkovatka nor under Ponary, the decisive success of the advancing troops was not achieved. By July 12th, the offensive capabilities of Walter Model's group in the northern face of the Kursk were exhausted. He was forced to stop the attack and move on to defense. The battles in the following days did not bring the Germans even limited tactical success. If the Central Front managed to stabilize its defense on the 5th day of the battle, then on the Voronezh Front the situation at that moment was close to critical. Moreover, the terrain contributed to the introduction of a maneuverable war and the constant transfer of the main strike points. According to the analogy with the Ferdinands, in the same way, on the southern face of the Kursk bulge, the Tigers and Panthers were met with a hurricane of artillery fire, which made it very difficult to Deming. As a result, the Tigers were blown up on unremovable mines and failed even with unbroken armor. He lost his Tiger, jumping onto the mine on July 5th, and the future German tank Ace Michael Wittmann. The enemy's tank and infantry divisions literally tied a strip of Soviet fortifications in the labyrinth. However, the combat experience of the German troops and their new equipment still did their job. The Germans began to concentrate their forces on narrow areas. It is worth noting that on the first day of the battle on the Kursk bulge, the Manstein group supported almost 400 aircraft. The air-to-air bomb tower crushed one anti-tank stronghold after another. As a result, by July 8th, the strike units of the German motorized formations and several tank divisions of the 4th Tank Army of Gotha and the Kempf group broke through 2 lines of defense of the Voronezh Front and wedged into a depth of more than 20 kilometers. In order to liquidate the breakthrough, Vatutin threw into battle his reserves, the 1st Tank Army of Kotakov and the 5th Guards Tank Corps of Lieutenant General Kravchenko. Our troops suffered heavy losses. In particular, in one day of fighting, only Kravchenko's corps lost about 100 tanks. It is necessary to note that the Soviet tanks T-34-76, which fought in the summer of 1943 near Kursk, in order to hit the Tiger, it was necessary to approach the enemy at a distance of 500 meters and hit the thin side armor. In turn, the German Tigers and Panthers could pierce even the frontal armor of the T-34 from a distance of more than 2 kilometers. Meanwhile, the German command was striving to develop the achieved success, continuing to increase its efforts along the Belgorod-Oboyan Highway. The 2nd Tank Corps of the SS Paul Hausser, by the end of July 9th, not only broke through to the 3rd line of defense, but also managed to wedge into it for about 9 kilometers to the southwest of Prokhorovka. However, the Germans did not manage to break through to the operational space. On July 10th, Hitler ordered the commander of the Army Group South to achieve a decisive breakthrough during the battle, making sure that it was impossible to break the resistance of the troops of the Voronezh Front in the Oboyan direction. Feldmarschall Manstein decided to change the direction of the main blow and now advanced to Kursk through Prokhorovka. Here the Germans withdrew all their reserves, about 400 combat vehicles from the selected tank divisions. In turn, in order to break the offensive and defeat the enemy strike group, the command of the Voronezh Front made a counterblow on July 12th, which later went down in history as the Prokhorov tank battle. From the very beginning of the advance of the Soviet troops, it became obvious that the counterblow was clearly not developing according to plan. Only in one day of fighting, the 5th Guards Tank Army of Rotmistrov, forced to advance in a narrow corridor between the Sayal River and the railway, lost 340 tanks and could not reach the Yakovlev district. Nevertheless, despite the significant losses, the troops of the Voronezh Front, which defended the area in the Prokhorovka region until July 16th, fulfilled their task and did not allow the Germans to break through the defense and enter the operational space. The path to the enemy in Kursk was closed. On July 16th, at the order of Manstein, the withdrawal of the main forces of the Army Group South to the original positions began. There was simply nothing for the Germans to advance further. At this point, the defensive phase of the Kursk battle came to an end. On July 12th, at the northern section of the Kursk Arc, the Red Army went on the offensive within the framework of the previously planned operation in Kutuzov, in order not to allow the Hitlerites to transfer additional reserves to Kursk. The second stage of the Kursk battle began. At the same time, the troops of the Voronezh and Stepno fronts, pursuing the retreating enemy troops, by July 23rd, went to the borders occupied before the start of the defensive operation, and on August 3rd, they had already switched to a quadruple offensive in the Belgorod-Kharkov direction.